When a nation gets invaded and defeated, they generally have two choices. Retreat to whatever you have available and continue the fight, perhaps hoping for other nations to come and save you, or you sign a treaty with the invader, thereby acknowledging your defeat and hopefully lessening the conditions of the peace. Depending on the situation, both can make sense, and during World War II, we saw both strategies utilized. Upon the invasion of Denmark, the government surrendered fast, and they continued to operate as normal for much of World War II, despite the German occupation. Alternatively, following the fall of the Netherlands, the royal family fled to London, from where, for the entire duration of the war until its eventual liberation, they continued to call for disobedience from the German occupiers and propagandize their planned return. We all know which part France chose in our timeline. They surrendered, legitimizing German control over northern France, while building a new pro-German regime in the south. But this leaves the question, what if France did choose the other option, and retreated to continue the fighting? Now, to answer this question, we first need to know why they surrendered in the first place. As you might imagine, it was not an easy decision to surrender to their arch rival. But fact is, the British just had to pull their forces from the continent, while about 400,000 Belgian and French soldiers were captured. France was outnumbered 2-1 on the battlefield, and the German advance seemed unstoppable. Soon, Paris fell, and it became clear that France couldn't defend the mainland, especially as Italy too entered the conflict. So, we need to be very clear here. France not surrendering does not entail a brave last stand in southern France, holding back the Germans for years. No, France would be occupied sooner rather than later. Now, Germany can hold all of mainland France, as well as all of the soldiers captured, hostage. What does this mean? Well, France initially got a relatively light treatment after surrender, with, officially, the Vichy regime remaining territorially intact, with relative autonomy in the south. Cities like Paris were mostly spared from devastation. Considering the inevitability by this point that all of mainland France will be occupied by the Germans, should they continue the fight from their colonies, this would, above all else, risk the lives of every person remaining in France, in hopes that, in a seemingly hopeless military situation, Britain will be able to clutch out a victory. I can forgive France for not taking that chance. Another major factor was Philippe Pétain. He had been a war hero of World War I, and in France's moment of crisis was called upon to serve as the vice premier in 1940. He represented a quite dominant and growing political grouping in France, especially after Germany's successes, that France had become too weak, too liberal and too socialist. What France needed for a national revival was a strong, authoritarian figure, preferably himself, of course, which would be able to minimize the damage that Germany would do on France and work to revive France in the long term. Once the military situation deteriorated, Pétain increasingly favored surrendering and leaving Britain out to fight alone. Yet, there were two suggestions that might lead to France continuing the fight. The first is quite well known, albeit rather unrealistic. It was a proposal by Churchill to combine the French and British nations into a single union. What an interesting idea that I plan to explore one day. I can tell you right now, it would never realistically happen. A more realistic proposal is one that was actually discussed by the French government. On the 15th of June, with military defeat near inevitable, it represented a compromise. The French army on the mainland was lost, and it would lay down its arms and surrender to the Germans. This way, hopefully, some goodwill could be created with the Germans, preventing the worst of retributions on the French population. Elsewhere though, the French would continue to fight against the Axis powers. Pétain, deputy prime minister, and arguably the most powerful man in the French government, was initially open to this plan. But General Weygand persuaded him to reject it. Prime Minister Renaud, unable to sort out a compromise, resigned. And now Prime Minister Pétain reached out to Germany for peace terms. The main issue that Pétain had with the plan to continue fighting was the necessity for the government to relocate to either North Africa or, even worse, London. Both would constitute, in his mind, a grave humiliation for France. This feeling would effectively doom the odds of France continuing the conflict, as the two highest-ranking military men stood united behind the need for a complete capitulation against Germany. Even if Renault had staunchly refused to surrender, he'd have swiftly lost his nerve and control over his government, as the Germans continue to barrel down south. I think that by far the best way to have France continue to fight is through Pétain. As the hero of World War I, now coming back to lead the nation through another tough fight, he would, if he believed in the need to, be in the best position to convince the military, government, and people of France to risk it all on this gamble and resist the Germans. Of course, this would require Pétain swallowing his pride and retreating to Algeria. Meanwhile, the French army on the mainland still surrenders to the Germans, besides a couple 100,000, which are evacuated to North Africa too. Now, the extent of this change might not immediately be apparent, but the impact on World War II by this singular act of French bravery is immense. First off, Vichy France does not exist. You may think, why does this matter? In other nations, the Germans found collaborators too. Why couldn't they in France? Well, of course, they could. The difference, however, is that Vichy France could reasonably claim to be the legitimate French government. The entire French colonial empire, at least initially, fell under German influence, while nations like America recognized the Vichy regime. The creation of Vichy France was a masterstroke of German diplomacy. Militarily, it ensured control over mainly North Africa, as Britain was hesitant about striking Vichy France fully, with especially Tunis proving incredibly useful to save Italy in North Africa. Besides that, the French fleet, which was still formidable, could not join up with the British Navy. Politically, it also allowed Germany to better legitimize their occupation and thus help reduce resistance movements in France. Even better, the Germans very much propagandized to Britain that not only was their only ally just conquered, it had switched sides. The British were so paranoid about this French fleet that they would attack it themselves, which gave Germany yet another propaganda piece in convincing Frenchmen that they were right in abandoning Britain. None of this now happens, as the French Empire and its navy continues to fight alongside the British, with massive ramifications for World War II going forward. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But before we dive into the military future of World War II, I want to focus on perhaps the most important part of this timeline. In our timeline, after taking charge of Vichy France, Pétain would start a number of reforms, tearing down French democracy while embracing traditionalist ideals of nobility and Catholicism. It would be wrong to fully classify the regime as ultranationalist in the style of Italy or Germany, but it could be rather comparable to a regime like Franco's in Spain. In opposition to this Vichy regime stood Charles de Gaulle, who had fled to London to create a French government in exile himself, which, throughout the war, would gain more and more legitimacy. Once the Germans were defeated, Pétain would be trialed as a war criminal, while de Gaulle would return France to a liberal democracy. In this alternate timeline, with Pétain continuing the war from North Africa, his personal politics and beliefs have not changed, and he would still believe in the need to drastically reform the nation. The difference? He is now doing it as the official ally to Britain and later America. While I doubt these nations would be enthusiastic about the fall of French democracy, they would shut up about it, at the very least until the war was over, as long as French men and ships continued to fight for their side. Then, another major long-term issue, Pétain had an intense hatred for the British, which was part of the reason that he was okay with collaborating with the Germans. His continued alliance with Britain would be merely pragmatic, a means of one day reclaiming the continent. But France and Britain would mostly operate independently with an uneasy military partnership, as France refuses to be folded into Britain's military structure. Then, time for the military matters, where it swiftly becomes clear that France's decision is a lot more impactful than it might have seemed. Germany focuses their efforts now on Britain, annoyed at the French continuation of the conflict, but not devastated, as they consider it a pointless distraction. After all, Britain would soon surrender, and France would have to follow. How wrong they would be. The most crucial front impacted would be Africa. In our timeline, the fall of France meant Italy's western border was safe, as they tried, and subsequently failed, to overrun Egypt, while losing the war in East Africa as well. So, Germany had to send Rommel and the Afrika Korps, who successfully turned the war around and delayed Axis defeat in Africa for years. Now imagine this alternate Africa war, and the fate of the Libyan front should be very clear, as French and British forces overrun Italian positions by 1941, to great humiliation for the Italians, without Rommel even being able to make it to the continent. Now this wouldn't immediately lead to the collapse of the Italian government, but it would greatly discredit them, as the Germans would have serious doubts about their only major ally, especially as they embarrassingly fail in Greece too, forcing Germany to intervene on their behalf. Now, the Italian army was thoroughly humiliated, as Italy didn't really have any other fronts to even fight on anymore. But before we continue in Europe, Asia might be seriously affected by our changes too. A region that played an outsized role in the Pacific War was French Indochina, not just for its military significance, but also because of its symbolic value and geographic location. Japan and Germany were quite open partners in World War II, and following the establishment of Vichy France, Japan would take steps to increasingly take control over the region without having to go to war with the West. For America and Britain, this was terrifying. They were very aware of Japanese ambitions in Asia, and Indochina just happened to be the perfect launching point for invasions across the region. Tensions between the US and Japan had already been rising as a result of the war in China, as well as Japan's open alliance with Germany and claims on American territory. But this invasion of northern Indochina was the final straw. An embargo was placed on American metal exports to Japan, which was already quite serious, as Japan imported 75% of its scrap metal and 90% of their copper from the US, making it decently crippling to the Japanese economy. But then, Japan also invaded the rest, and America responded by freezing Japanese assets in the States, as well as a complete embargo on Japanese oil imports. Japan was now faced with a dilemma: submit to American demands and retreat from Indochina and China, as without oil, their war effort was doomed in the long term, or go out with a bang and try to seize Southeast Asia. Japan would choose the latter. So, what about this has changed in our timeline? Well, Japan might have a worse chance to peacefully secure Indochina. This does not mean that they don't try. Japan had started putting pressure on the colonial government way before France even fell, and it is likely that the French colonial government at least gives in to the initial list of demands, leading to the first round of American demands, while France and Britain start taking Japan seriously as a future enemy. But the big question is the rest of Indochina. One way or another, it is very likely that the aggressive Japanese military, even without approval from the government in Tokyo, would at least try to take full control over the region, leading to the US ramping up the pressure on the Japanese industry. But perhaps the main question is whether Pétain considers Indochina a temporary, regrettable loss, but not important enough compared to the European war, or if Pétain decides to make it a point of principle and attempts to draw Britain into an early war with Japan. If France accepts the loss, we practically return to our timeline in Asia. If France doesn't, things get more interesting. This now completely eliminates the factor of surprise in Japan's invasions, while America still announces their sanctions on Japan and even threatens intervention if Japan enters Philippine waters. Considering that it is more interesting to explore something new, let's assume the second for the sake of this scenario. But first, let's return to Europe, where Germany has launched an invasion of the Soviet Union at around the same time as in our timeline. Rommel and his Africa Corps would now be a part of this invasion, but this really isn't enough to fundamentally change the balance of power during this fight, as Germany pushes about as far as they did in our timeline. But something else has changed, and that is the battle for the Mediterranean. Churchill was a very vocal proponent of the Southern strategy, striking into Europe through its weak underbelly, also known as Italy. This would be far easier to accomplish in this timeline, as with Africa being secured by 1941, planning for an invasion of southern Italy could already commence. Midway through 1942, with Germany busy with their push towards the Caucasus, we might see a joint Franco-British invasion of Sicily. This would be yet another shock to the Italian regime, which had now lost their colonies, fumbled the Balkans, and was under active invasion. As the Allies increased their pressure on the Italians, we can very much expect a collapse of their regime like in our timeline, forcing Germany to take control over Italy and redirect forces there a year earlier. Don't expect the Allies to now swiftly overrun Italy, they get stuck even faster than in our timeline, but the fall of Italy still represents a major blow to the European Axis. Now, considering the Soviets already managed to destroy the German push in our timeline, they absolutely would do the same in this timeline. Germany's offensives are broken, and they are now officially under siege. That leaves the question of the USA, whose entry into the war could very much be determined by Japan. However, I somewhat doubt that it would be much later than in our timeline. As Japan starts their invasions of British colonies, the sheer threat of America joining the war will be immense. And considering the Philippines are such a major choke point for Japanese shipping, I think it's nearly guaranteed that Japan still drags the US into the war, likely with a gambit similar to Pearl Harbor still being carried out. From here though, it is quite possible that Japan performs significantly worse in their invasions. They now lack at least months of planning the invasions from occupied Indochina. While it is safe to say that the Philippines would definitely still fall, as would Malaysia and probably major parts of Indonesia, it is possible that at some point, mostly around Burma, Japan gets stuck earlier than in our timeline. Either way, by the time America gets heavily involved in Europe, Europe already looks something like this. This presents a huge opportunity in speeding up World War II. In our timeline, by 1943, Britain and America seriously disagreed over how to combat Germany. The British favored the previously mentioned southern strategy, invading Italy. America preferred a bolder move, an invasion of northern France. The British won out in our timeline, but things could be very different now. The Allies are already in Italy, and progress there is painstakingly slow. Besides that, the Americans didn't take de Gaulle seriously. After the war, Roosevelt initially didn't want to give France an occupation zone in Germany, and even considered treating France as an Axis power. You may have noticed that during meetings between the great Allied leaders, de Gaulle was never invited. The reason for this was very simple. America had recognized the Vichy regime. This is not the case in this alternate timeline, and as such, Pétain would have to be taken seriously, as one of the major Allied powers. Considering all of these points, Allied command preparing for an invasion of France by 1943 is not crazy. Now I must be honest, there are serious debates about the viability of such an invasion. By 1943, the intense preparations of our timeline would be reduced by a year, as some of the technologies used in our timeline weren't even invented yet. On the other hand though, the Germans had also invested far less into their defenses by this point, and they would have been quite distracted elsewhere. Personally though, I think a landing in 1943 would have been possible in securing a beachhead in northern France, while in the south, the French and Americans launch an invasion too. Towards the end of an alternate 1943, the situation for Germany is already very dire. Now I won't bore you with the specifics of the rest of the war too much. We all know that by this point the Germans are doomed. But just compare our alternate 1943 to that of our timeline, and you will notice one big difference. The West has already pushed out far, far more. So, by the time of an alternate German collapse, whenever that may be, we can expect the West to have reached Berlin, and perhaps yet further territories in the East. It is even possible that through Greece, the Allies might have pushed further into the Balkans. So, by the time a peace deal is signed, the Soviets likely still get an occupation zone over Eastern Germany, as was agreed way beforehand between Allied leaders, but it might be smaller, as nations like Czechia or potentially even Austria might be allowed in the Western sphere, or Soviet influence in nations like Albania or Bulgaria is greatly reduced. The specifics are difficult to tell, but point is, the Soviet sphere ends up far smaller. But for the post-war world, Pétain is actually the biggest change. His nationalistic French government identified two enemies of the French state: Germany, now defeated, and Britain. This would greatly impact the way he negotiates with the Allied powers. And remember, he would be taken far more seriously than de Gaulle in our timeline. You can expect Pétain taking a far more aggressive stance, demanding an annexation of the Saarland, French occupation of the Rhineland, and potentially even annexations of Italian territories. Now, that is not to say that America and Britain actually allow these actions, but at the very least, the annexation of the Saarland and parts of Libya are decently likely. Beyond these borders though, Europe as a whole would be far less unified. Pétain would eventually be forced by his allies to accept German reunification, but he would refuse to ever give up the Saarland. Also, the idea of European cooperation, like in the European coal and steel community, would also be unlikely, as even now, Pétain would deeply distrust the Germans. Let's also take a quick detour to Asia. The earlier collapse of Germany would mean that the Soviets enter the Asian theater earlier too. As Soviet tanks are rolling down Korea, while the Americans are liberating the Pacific and launching airstrikes on the mainland, I don't expect the Japanese to hold out for as long as they did in our timeline, as Hirohito eventually breaks the deadlock and forces Japan to surrender. This leads to one rather interesting change. Atomic bombs were never used to cause the surrender of Japan. I know that opinion is divided on the matter, but in my opinion, with Soviet forces entering Beijing, while America is starving Japan of resources and their industry was practically destroyed, Japan was not going to continue the war either way. This could lead to big changes in post-war Japan, as the shock of the nuclear bomb deeply impacted their post-war culture, while America's victory in the Pacific would be far less controversial, and nuclear weapons as a whole, at least initially, less taboo for military purposes. Beyond that though, it is unlikely to lead to massive changes in Asia. If anything, the communists would be stronger in the Chinese Civil War, while America and the Soviets split Korea, again as agreed beforehand. Nations like India and Indonesia would soon receive independence, while Pétain would draw France into the First Indochina War. We now return to a Europe entirely different, all thanks to one man. Even more so than in our timeline, France will try to play the third power in Europe. His hatred of Germany ruins the odds of European integration, while their hatred towards the British could very easily also ruin their integration into NATO, which he may very well see as submitting France to Britain and America. Now don't get me wrong, Pétain still very much dislikes the Soviets and communism more, and France would still be a great ally of the West, but the overall cohesion of the Western Bloc is greatly reduced. Perhaps France's diplomatic position in the world could be best compared to Francoist Spain. In fact, Pétain and Franco had been close friends, with Pétain having served as the French ambassador to Spain, and the two men have fought a war in Morocco together. As Pétain cements France as an authoritarian state, we can expect France, Spain, and Portugal to form some sort of informal Latin axis together, the final three autocracies in Western Europe. But long-term predictions by this point become near impossible, as it depends to a very large degree on the future of France and the stability of Petain's regime. Does his successor continue his regime, or is France steadily, or even violently, returned to a democracy? Might it even be possible that France sees a communist revolution in the early years of the Cold War? It's important to note that by 1945, Pétain was already 98 years old, and his mental health would swiftly deteriorate in the years following. His most likely successor might be Pierre Laval, Prime Minister in Vichy France. A much more brutal and hard-handed figure, it is unlikely that his government in France remains very popular. But on the other hand, out of a fear of a communist takeover in the nation, America might just continue to prop up the French dictatorship for decades. So, what is the main takeaway from this timeline? Well, it is a significant reduction in the unity, economy, and importance of Europe. Without the cooperation of France, European unity is doomed. In our timeline, Austria got a deal where they could unify, but they would need to be permanently neutral. A similar deal was discussed for Germany, but it didn't happen in our timeline. But now, we could very well have France oppose German membership in NATO heavily. At the same time, Soviet East Germany is quite pathetic, making the concept of a neutral, unified Germany far more appealing to both sides. As a neutral bloc starts ascending in Central Europe, potentially de-escalating the Cold War on the continent. I think it's quite likely that France's desire to hold on to Africa would be their eventual demise. Even in our timeline, the war in Algeria lasted for decades, taking up much of France's attention. It is now possible that they follow the path of Portugal in our timeline. Even despite all other European nations having decolonized and their colonies descending into costly independence wars, the Portuguese would refuse to leave and would fight for 18 years to keep their land. During this period, thanks to the dictatorship, the costly war, and a declining economy, the popularity of the government would plummet, until a coup would finally overthrow the government and start Portugal down a road to democracy. Quite possibly, the same thing could occur in France, and despite the tides clearly turning against colonialism, they staunchly continue to defend every inch of colonial territory. Due to this commitment, the humiliation of losing areas like Indochina, as well as seeing their African empire slowly but steadily become too unstable to keep hold of, would be even more intense. Fact is, fighting constant guerrilla wars just wasn't very sustainable, as the Soviets, and quite possibly even the Americans, could be aiding the anti-colonial forces. Likely, the shock of losing Algeria somewhere in the 60s would be the death nail to the authoritarian regime in France, as they once more turn into a democratic republic. When we leave this scenario, Europe, but especially France, is significantly poorer and weaker. With the new French regime, steps might be undertaken to strengthen European unity, but it is now very unlikely that neutral Germany could be included, as the Soviets would see that as a breach of Germany's constitutional neutrality. Europe, to its very core, is shaken, as even if or when the Soviets collapse, there is no European Union to spread eastwards, and with German neutrality, NATO too would have a hard time justifying their spread to the east, which, aside from the obvious economic impact of these changes, could also, depending on the regime in Moscow, have major implications on Eastern Europe geopolitically. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.